My involvement with Sufism has been there for a long time. Different schools, different forms of Sufism. But first, a few words about why I chose to write Tareeqat at this time. Tareeqat, the 7 elements of living Sufism in Pakistan. A few years ago, I lost a few dear friends to a suicide bombing. I have their blood on my hands and the blood of hundreds and thousands before and since then who have lost their lives to religious extremism in this country. I have their blood on my hands because I knew what was growing in our midst, and I chose to close my eyes and I chose to ignore it. It was perhaps too difficult for me, like many others, to blame those who were doing it in the name of religion. So I sought excuses for them. It was poverty, lack of education, lack of good governance, lack of speedy justice. It was because of this or that country out there. But I felt too uncomfortable to put my finger on the growing formal religiosity in our midst that justifies giving and taking of lives in the name of this or that interpretation of religion. So I closed my eyes, ignored, and turned away. And in the cover of the excuses and justifications provided by us, the violence of the religious extremists continued to grow, used by economic groups like the conflict between the landlords and the urban population in Jhang, the city where some of the earliest militant, violent religious groups come from. This was much before 9/11, or whether used by countries like the US to counter the Soviet threat. We kept our focus on who was using them and not what was being used. This growing ability for violence by extremist religious groups and its prerequisite, the growing formal religiosity in the masses. It is the growing surface level formal religiosity in the masses that invariably produces, nurtures, and then protects the extremists by always diverting attention from them, by coming up with excuses and justifications for them. Ending extremism is not possible without challenging this rapid growth of formal religiosity in the general masses.
On the other hand, the land and the people that constitute Pakistan today have a history of civilization that goes back to 11,000 years, to Mehergarh, to the Indus Valley, to Gandhara. There are deep-rooted spiritual tendencies that run through the veins of the people here that are much deeper than any mental formal construct introduced by the religious right today. There is a tremendous need for Pakistanis to recognize these spiritual currents buried deep in their psyche and to stay in touch with them. When Islam came to this land, it was the mystics of Islam, the Sufis, who basically attracted people to Islam. What is important to recognize is that their spirituality was very much in line with the already existing spiritual currents in the psyche of the people here. This was very different from the formal Islamic discourse and also the formal religiosity of the Brahmins before that. While on the outer level, several of the Sufi lineages went through deterioration, where one can witness different levels of abuses in that context. It was basically the poetry of the Sufis that the people of this land were mostly attracted to. Hardly any of the Sufis tried to convert people to Islam. They just lived their spirituality, they lived their lives intensely. If there was not a threat to this lived spirituality, it would have been better to let it continue like that, because there's something beautiful about a life intensely, fully lived, without being overly mindful of its own spirituality. But today, given the threat from the formal religious discourse and indoctrination, it becomes necessary to be mindful of the spiritual elements, not necessarily the formal spirituality either, but the spiritual elements that are part of the everyday lives, that are woven into the everyday lives of the people of this land. Tareeqat is a book specifically written for this purpose. It was recently launched in Islamabad and Lahore. In very simple words, it outlines 7 elements of local spirituality in Pakistan that need to be recognized, protected, and lived with pride against the current onslaught of formalism. These are not the elements that are necessarily most needed, but the ones that are already present in the collective psyche of the land. Some of these elements actually have very strong shadow sides to them as well. These are also outlined in the book. These are negative manifestations if that element is allowed to consume the psyche, losing its balance with the other elements. And lastly, not to get lost in an intellectual discourse, along with the verses and visuals, the book also gives everyday practices after each element that can enhance and strengthen these elements in our everyday lives.